On this video, I would like to begin a new video series on the book of Proverbs. We have been working through Ecclesiastes, and I continue to work through the Kohelet, looking at the grammar and doing an inductive analysis of the grammar. I also have finished the book of Job with inductive Hebrew grammar. And now I want to continue the Proverbs. I've done some in the Proverbs, but I want to pick up in chapter 10 and begin slowly going through some more. I haven't done chapter 10 and following in that regard. Let me just say, in terms of the background to the Proverbs, I felt there's a good summary of the overall, divisions that are found. And I really appreciated Dr. Cohen's work, Reverend Dr. A. Cohen, the work that he did in the Sonsino books of the Bible in the introduction. And he writes about the divisions that make up the Proverbs. And I thought it was a very wonderful summary. First of all, you have clearly marked divisions. You have the introduction in chapter 1, 1 to 7. This is giving the title and stating the object of the book, followed then by a series of moral addresses that start in 1:8 and go through chapter 7, verse 27. This is followed then by two discourses on the nature of wisdom in chapters 8 and 9. Number 2, the first collection of aphorisms starts in 10:1 and goes through 22:16, introduced by the heading, The Proverbs of Solomon. Part 3, the second collection then of aphorisms or proverbs, pithy saying, begins in 22, verse 17, and goes on through 24, verse 34, prefaced by an introductory section in chapter 22, verses 17 to 21, and ending with an appendix in chapter 24, 23 to 34, entitled, These Also Are Sayings of the Wise. The third collection, number 4, of aphorisms is found in chapters 25 through chapter 29, beginning with an editorial note. These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied out. Then number 5, you have the words of Agor ben Yakeh in chapter 30. Part 6, or number 6, you have the words of King Lemuel in chapter 31, 1 to 9. And then number 7, you have the praise of the Eshet Ha'il, the ideal wife, in chapters 31, 10 to 31. That's what I call my wonderful wife, Janet, my Eshet Ha'il, wife of valor, A+++. Following this, as we look at an introduction to the Proverbs, probably the word that best describes it is the word mishle. It's a term which has a variety of meaning, but I think in the Proverbs the best understanding would be ethical aphorisms or pithy short sayings that teach a way to live in this world. I think the Proverbs basically have to do with everyday living. And yet it goes back to God because He's the author of life, of everything. So you don't have necessarily uh, different doctrinal teachings like in the book of Romans, for example, but you have everyday living, like go to the ant and or don't answer a fool according to his folly, and so forth. Basically, or can I say, laughter is medicine for the soul. Uh, Short, pithy sayings that teach us how to live. And many have looked at the Proverbs as basically a way of teaching practical truths. Some have said basically anyone, it can be applied to anyone. It's the way of living successfully. And it goes back to the Lord, who has defined what living should be about. And this would be true whether one was a Christian or a Jewish person or a person in general. In other words, it's better to, let's say, laugh and enjoy life than to do the opposite. Or the tongue. It talks about the tongue and how to use the tongue wisely rather than destructively. And the other thing that's interesting about the Proverbs is that the authors use what is called synonymous parallelism, antithetical parallelism, and synthetic parallelism. These are terms that are often used in Hebrew poetry. Synonymous parallelism is where the second clause is reiterating the first. Again, I'm referring to Cohen on page introduction on page 13. For example, the evil bow before the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. Or a fool's mouth is his ruin, and his lips are a snare of his soul. In other words, the second line is saying the same thing as the first, but maybe with a little bit different wording. Antithetic, though, is where the second clause presents a contrast to the first. For example, a merry heart is a good medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones, in chapter 17:22. Notice the second line is antithetical, but contrasting with the first. Then you have synthetic parallelism, where the second clause continues the thought of the first. For example, it is the discretion of a man to be slow to anger, and it is his glory to pass over a transgression. We see this, for example, in 19 verse 11. Or love not sleep, lest you come to poverty. Open your eyes, and you shall have bread in plenty. The second line is just adding and continuing the thought of the first. So these are the three types of, can I say, uh, poetry designations that help us understand Hebrew poetry and how it's developed. Synonymous, parallelism, antithetical, and synthetic. And by the way, these are all found in the Psalms, the hymnic literature as well. So I want to just stop there. I'm just introducing the Proverbs, and then I think I'm going to go back and start working through them. I did appreciate this quote. The teaching of the Proverbs, for example, this is on page introduction to 14. Its teaching is applicable to all men, as we said, everywhere, and is true of life generally, and not of any particular people or land. The book of Proverbs, then, is the Hebrew "come with me" offered to all travelers along the road of life. And I appreciated those thoughts that help us to understand how the Proverbs are seeking to give wise counsel as to how to live life and how to live life effectively. And it all goes back to the Lord, of course, because He is the author of life. And He has defined how life then is to be lived. And so we could use the word mashal, the Hebrew word coming from, meaning proverb, coming from mishle, the plural form. And like I said, mashal is best understood as ethical aphorisms or ethical pithy sayings that help guide us into wisdom. I thought it was rather interesting. Also, note was made of the priest who dealt with individual laws and how to, what type of sacrifice one should do. You had your priestly people, then you had your prophets that were those that would explain what God's plan was in terms of how to live life effectively and also to warn the people. The prophet then spoke, he was the Nabi. He taught what was believed to be the way, in a prophetic way, that God was speaking. Then you had the Hochamim, the wise teachers, or the wise. Their goal was to teach sort of ethically how to live life effectively. But all of this goes back to God, to the Lord as the author. And for me, as a Christian minister, back, I believe, to the triune Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. One more word. The Proverbs are what we call wisdom literature. In the Hebrew scriptures, we have the Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes as, again, as wisdom literature about how to live life effectively. And these are three of my very favorite books, along with the hymnic literature. The hymnic literature are the Tehillim, the Psalms, and they're wonderful. I've done a lot of my videotaping and grammars or writing on the Hebrew grammar in the Messianic Psalms. And I love the Psalms as well. They're more hymns. Um, but Proverbs is part of this wisdom literature telling us how to live life successfully, contrasting the foolish way with the wise way.